0426 hours, March 18th, 1982, Petrozavodsk radar station. Karelia. The cold is absolute. Snowflakes flicker like static against the floodlights inside the concrete bunker. Captain Leonid Morozov leans into his console, the hum of Soviet radar equipment filling the room like breath in the cold. The walls are lined with screens, green-lit vectors, aircraft symbols, altitude codes, standard patterns, standard operations. Outside, at nearby Petrozavodsk airfield, a flight of MiG-23s prepares for a routine readiness drill. No alert sounded yet. No orders issued. Just idle turbines warming under camouflage tarps. Then the impossible happens. Morozov's scope shifts. A single flicker. One symbol appears 70 kilometers to the northwest. An inbound NATO signature. But the MiGs haven't taken off yet. He checks the transponder feed. The bogey is not flying, it's watching. 4 more symbols appear arc-shaped, following a precise semicircle. The pattern is unmistakable. AWACS. Morozov's fingers hover over the keyboard. Impossible, he mutters. The AWACS aren't supposed to be in range, much less tracking aircraft still grounded. And yet there it is. A full formation, drawing perfect vectors around MiGs still taxiing on wet asphalt. He radios command, "Static," then a voice your feed's corrupted. No such signals on National Grid, but Morozov's console keeps rendering F-15 intercept paths based on MiG heat. Bloom not from radar, but something deeper. The Americans had eyes not in the sky, but in time. He stares at the readout. The MiGs haven't taken off. The AWACS already knows where they'll go. Morozov slams the console power. Silence. The green blips vanish, replaced by flickering darkness. Snow beats harder against the bunker door. He exhales. They'd trained to hunt that aircraft. No one trained to be hunted before the liftoff. Moscow had built the radar lines, the intercept grids, the kill boxes. But the Americans had built something else, something unthinkable. The screen didn't fail that morning. It showed the future. Moscow. Soviet Air Defense Command, underground complex beneath Leninsky Prospect. The year is 1982, but it might as well be 1962. Wood paneling, fluorescent flicker, coffee thick as oil, and confidence thicker still. On the wall, a scale model of the PVO air defense network. SAM rings from Murmansk to Vladivostok. Dozens of radar chains, interceptor regiments, kill corridors. Nothing enters Soviet airspace unnoticed. Marshal Viktor Kulikov, hero of Kursk, chief of the Warsaw Pact Forces, circles the table. His voice echoes. AWACS a flying barn. Easy kill. General Yuri Petrov, head of GCI coordination, chuckles. No radar sees through clouds of steel. Let them come. Colonel Sidorov, signals engineer from the S-200 Vega project, nods toward a map. We outnumber them 10-1 in tubes. NATO builds toys. We build systems. They all agree. The Americans are investing in gimmicks, expensive airborne radars that broadcast their own death, F-15s that rely on uplinks instead of eyes, dangerous ideas, fragile networks. Petrov waves a folder. Intercept tapes from the Baltic Clean. No evidence of predictive tracking, only propaganda. A junior analyst, wet behind the ears from the Zhukovsky Academy, raises a hand. But, sir, some patterns suggest the room turns. Kulikov frowns. American eyes. We jam them blind. The West loves gadgets. We love physics. Dismissals come easily in this room. They're spoken with authority and backed by doctrine built on victories. Radar supremacy had downed Gary Powers. SAM belts kept American wings out of Vietnam's north. Soviet MiGs humiliated Israeli Phantoms in 1973. Why should 1982 be any different? One aide brings tea. Kulikov doesn't look up. If the Americans had radar that good, he says, we'd already be dead. Silence, laughter, meeting adjourned. Meeting. But there's one document on the table no one opens. A telex from Petrozavodsk. Blurred radar data. Time-stamped before takeoff. Discarded as noise. They didn't need to read it. Their truth was already written. American technology was a bluff. Doctrine was destiny. Their certainty would become their blindness. The Americans had stopped talking. They had started building. The Soviet Union did not improvise air defense. It architected it mathematically, hierarchically, unapologetically. The doctrine was known as integrated air defense, a layered system built not for flexibility, but for certainty. From the moment an enemy breached the edge of Warsaw-Pact airspace, three forces would converge: early warning radar, intercept fighter regiments, and surface-to-air missile corridors, detection, direction, destruction. Each node reported up. Nothing acted alone. The underlying assumption was simple, centralized vision, centralized control. The eyes were radar. The brain was ground control interception GCI. The fists were MiG-21s and SA-2s. And the timing measured in seconds they believed would always be theirs. To outsiders, it looked rigid. To Soviet planners, it was a machine, and the machine worked. From the 1960 U-2 shootdown to the defense of North Vietnamese skies, this doctrine killed myths of American invincibility. Soviet SAM operators were credited with over 1,300 aircraft in Southeast Asia. Even Israeli air dominance in 1973 broke against Soviet-built belts in Syria. The Americans, they said, flew faster. But the Soviets saw further. At the heart of this vision was man and machine together, but separate. Pilots were told when to climb, when to turn, when to fire. Autonomy was risk. Discipline was survival. Yegorov, the famed designer of the S-200 Vega, once said, radar tells truth. Pilots obey it. He meant it as praise. The Vega system itself was a monster, 240 kilometers of reach, a missile the size of a torpedo, and guidance precision refined by half a century of Soviet mathematics. Vega didn't guess. Vega computed. But in its perfection lay the blind spot. This doctrine assumed war meant response, that the signal would always come before the shot, that the radar would always see the threat coming, and the controller would always speak in time. There was no room for prediction, only reaction. So when American systems began making decisions before Soviet radars even lit up, when interceptors launched into nothingness and still found targets, the doctrine had no answer. They had built a castle of equations. The Americans weren't climbing it. They were walking through walls. Petrozavodsk radar station. Snow falls sideways. The MiG-23s are still parked. A flicker. Western Arc. E-3 Sentry signature. NATO AWACS. A 042712 AWACS altitude, 3480 feet, heading east-northeast. Speed 450 knots. 042716, MiG canopies close. Crew chief signal, no radio chatter from the runway. 042722, AWACS uplink activates. Vector assign, F-15s on patrol shift headings before MiGs even taxi. 042727, Soviet radar confirms NATO fighters adjusting course toward Besovets. Still no Soviet liftoff. 042738, MiG-23 engines ignite. Turbines scream. Tower gives clearance. 042741, AWACS marks new intercept solution. Fighter wing separates into two subflights. One holds, one accelerates. 042750, Soviet command orders radio silence breach. Who authorized vector data? The radar officer replies, no one. It's predictive. Nons 42800, first MiG lifts off, second begins roll. AWACS ping updates, vectors adjust in real time. 042811, F-15s initiate climb. Altitude 7 out on feet. No radar lock, no visual, only algorithmic trajectory. 042819. Soviet GCI reports path convergence in 8 minutes. How did they calculate our flight path? Silence. Colonel Demidov watches from the secondary station. He had trained GCI controllers for East Germany in the 1970s. He had mapped intercept spirals and radar lags. He knew every delay margin, every angle of error. What he saw broke every rule. "This is not reaction," he whispered. "They're flying futures." The F-15s weren't just matching Soviet liftoffs. They were intercepting decisions. By 0429, 003 MiGs are airborne. 2 NATO fighters already in flanking position. No radar emission, no electronic warfare, just presence. The Soviets had always believed radar dominance would decide the sky, but the Americans weren't using radar the way the Soviets did. They were using it to end the battle before the screen even lit up. No missiles were fired that day. It was a drill. But the numbers didn't lie. The MiGs were late. The interceptors were already there. And nobody could explain how. The sky wasn't just contested. It was pre-decided. Moscow. The after-action reports arrived 3 days later. Petrozavodsk relays the raw radar logs, intercepts time before liftoff, F-15's shifting trajectory before MiGs reached taxi speed. Predictive patterns too precise to be random. The report is stamped anomaly. Investigate further. But further never comes. First, the local GCI station is blamed. Operator error? Says Air Defense District Command. Signal misinterpretation due to snow scatter. Then the weather. Thermal layering can cause false vectors. Then sabotage. Possible NATO jamming from Finnish border. Each level adds a layer of insulation. Not understanding. In the Central Air Defense Planning Bureau, Major Vlasenko reviews the report. He'd run SIGINT analysis in Afghanistan. He knew disinformation, knew deception. The numbers were clean. The pattern was real. He flagged the incident. Possible unknown capability. Priority review? 2 days later, his supervisor overrode the tag. PSYOP artifact. NATO bluffing for fear advantage. The report is downgraded to electronic noise misclassified as vector prediction. No follow-up ordered. The anomaly is filed under routine deviation in a separate meeting. Soviet GCI specialists debate the math. One engineer proposes that the Americans may be analyzing heat signatures before takeoff. He's told to revise his equations. Heat blooms can't resolve vector intention. Another suggests AWACS could be triangulating using civilian emissions. He's laughed out of the room. By the end of the week, the incident is listed under operator training discrepancy. There is no mention of pre-takeoff detection, no acknowledgement of synchronized F-15 response. No alarm, only silence. Because to accept what the radar showed would mean accepting that the Americans had eyes inside the Soviet decision loop. And that was not possible. So they believed what was easier. The equipment was faulty. The snow was thick. The pilots were late. But not the truth. Not that the AWACS had seen a launch that hadn't happened. They had a choice, believe the impossible, or believe the world still made sense. They chose comfort. The Americans chose mathematics. The first theory came from NII-33, a military electronics institute outside Moscow. Their proposal, passive radar deception, a new kind of American spoofing, the AWACS. They claimed wasn't detecting aircraft, it was detecting the illusion of aircraft, conjured through bounced radio emissions off terrain features. The theory was elegant. If AWACS used side lobe reflections, perhaps NATO had figured out how to back-calculate aircraft intent from ground-based scatter. Soviet engineers called it ground ghosting. The Americans, they argued, were fooling their own radar into seeing patterns that didn't exist, then acting as if those patterns were real. The logic held, in theory. In Crimea, a test team built a simulation. They used mobile radar reflectors, mimicking MiG signatures. Data was run through reverse-calculated scatter grids. The result, erratic plots. Nothing matched the Petrozavodsk incident. Still, Moscow liked the answer. It made the impossible seem explainable. It meant the Americans were playing tricks, not rewriting physics. They commissioned further trials. More funding. Teams assigned to ground mapping the northern forests. AWACS cannot see pre-flight vectors, said the final memo. But it may think it does. Demidov, the East German GCI veteran, read the conclusion and shook his head. They think the Americans are seeing reflections. He paused. They're seeing intentions. But his warning didn't reach the decision tree. The new theory passed review. Moscow reclassified the March 18th intercept as an AWACS atmospheric mirage, amplified by terrain bounce. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. Because terrain doesn't predict timing, mirages don't vector fighters, and no radar reflection in Karelia can explain why American pilots were in position before Soviet engines were even warm. They were solving the wrong problem, and doing it brilliantly. By autumn, the first theory was fading. Ground ghosting couldn't explain pre-takeoff intercepts. It only described illusions, not outcomes. That's when the second explanation surfaced. This one didn't involve physics. It involved betrayal. In a closed-door meeting at the GRU's technical division, a new theory gained traction. NATO had infiltrated Soviet air bases, not with satellites, with people, a defector, a mole, a traitor on the inside feeding launch data to AWACS systems before aircraft even moved. The logic AWACS response times were too fast. F-15s adjusted course within seconds of Soviet pilot liftoff. The only plausible answer, pre-scramble warnings sent by human hands. They called it the saboteur signalman theory. KGB counterintelligence activated Operation Obzor, a wide-ranging audit of ground crews across 15 airfields. Technicians were re-interviewed, phone logs examined. Even locker contents were reviewed for signs of NATO sympathies. One aircraft handler at Petrozavodsk was arrested for unrelated contraband. Another was reassigned after suspicious conversations about Western music. Neither had anything to do with radar. Still, the theory held not because it had proof, but because it had certainty. To Moscow, betrayal made more sense than mathematics, and so began the purge. Airbase communications were overhauled. Scramble codes changed weekly. Technicians monitored other technicians. Officers sent shadow teams to verify maintenance logs. And all the while, the problem remained. AWACS still saw. F-15 still moved first. But now, the Soviet air defense network wasn't just facing NATO. It was fighting itself. Demidov submitted a memo. No pattern of human interference. AWACS behavior still indicates system-level prediction, not espionage. Response monitored Demidov for excessive NATO bias. While Moscow hunted phantoms, the sky stayed blind. The radar networks bristled. The interceptors drilled. But the threat wasn't in the hangars. It was in the algorithms. The GRU moved quickly. Full-spectrum collection. Directive signed by General Rogov, head of Directorate T, once responsible for atomic secrets during the Manhattan Project. No margin for error. NATO's AWACS was now top priority. Step 1. Technical analysis. Rogov ordered all available ELINT electronic intelligence on E-3 Sentry flights, flight logs, radar pulses, emissions. Signal spectrograms were mapped in Kaliningrad and Murmansk. Nothing stood out. Frequencies matched known templates. Bandwidth usage remained consistent. No abnormal shifts before or during MiG scrambles. Step 2. Physical inspection. A NATO F-4 Phantom downed in 1979 had its avionics transferred to Moscow for study. Engineers hoped the radar components might offer clues to NATO signal processing pipelines, but the F-4 wasn't an AWACS platform. No data fusion architecture, no predictive systems, just old wiring and cold circuitry. Step 3, signals interception. Every time an AWACS deployed near Soviet airspace, KGB listening posts across Eastern Europe scanned for command uplinks. They heard encrypted bursts, compressed, high volume, and impossible to decipher. Soviet systems lacked the processing speed to unpack them in real time. Stored for later, decrypted never. Step 4, satellite surveillance. Cosmodrome teams were tasked with imaging AWACS aircraft from orbit during takeoff and in-flight. What they saw confused them. Each aircraft had 6 massive antennae, rotating in coordinated sweep patterns expected, but no direct ground links visible. Just air-to-air relays. The Americans weren't just watching. They were networking. Step 5, human intelligence. Deep cover agents in West Germany reported NATO engineers speaking in code about look-ahead targeting and composite tracking. One transcript said, "We see them before they move, not because of radar, because of behavior." That phrase rattled Rogov. "Behavior isn't a signal," he snapped. No one in the room had an answer. The Soviets were looking directly at the data. They had wreckage, emission maps, frequencies, protocol intercepts, satellite imagery, test results, but none of it made sense because their framework was wrong. AWACS wasn't just radar. It was a concept, one that fused signals, predictions, and computing into a seamless sphere of vision. The Americans weren't just watching aircraft. They were reading the future through math, patterns, and integrated decision-making. And the GRU couldn't reverse engineer what they didn't understand. They had the hardware, they missed the language. The truth was never hidden. It had been flying at 30,000 feet. Round disk, 4 turbofans, a spinning dome that looked like science fiction. But the E-3 Sentry wasn't a plane. It was a revolution in the sky. AWACS radar. Soviet planners assumed airborne radar would be directional, narrow, vulnerable. The Americans built a phased array system that saw everything, 360 degrees, 325-kilometer radius, real-time tracking of up to 600 targets, while Soviet GCI radars swept once every 10 seconds. AWACS refreshed at under 3.2 seconds. It didn't wait to see threats. It watched the theater breathe. At Petrozavodsk, the Sentry had already mapped the MiG base layout, new warm-up times, new runway traffic patterns. The moment engines spooled, vectors were calculated automatically. Data fusion Soviets transmitted data by voice ground to pilot, radar to headquarters, fragmented, delayed. The Americans fused radar, satellite, ELINT, and aircraft sensors into a unified picture. The AWACS didn't just send information. It processed it, interpreted it, and redistributed it in real time. F-15 pilots didn't just hear a warning. They received a pre-visualized intercept trajectory, a digital flight path. AWACS saw the puzzle, said Colonel James Roberts, an AWACS integration test pilot. We just flew the solution. Combat example. 1983 Greenland air exercise 0438 hours. MiG-23s begin scramble. 0440 AWACS updates path. F-15 split. 0442 first intercept achieved before MiGs reach 10,000 feet. No radar lock, no visual, just prediction, math, and positional authority. Secure burst comms Soviets relied on encrypted HF and UHF, jammed frequently and easily triangulated. AWACS used satellite burst transmission, compressed digital packets with layered encryption. Every intercept order was invisible to Soviet sensors. No chatter, no signals, just sudden enemy repositioning. IFF and Threat Database. Soviet crews manually identified targets using radar profile and position. AWACS held a database of over 400 aircraft signatures. Each detected contact was automatically tagged, friend, foe, unknown. In one NATO test, an F-15 intercepted a simulated Soviet target with full threat profile loaded 6.4 seconds after detection. Mission computer. The AWACS was more than radar. It was an airborne mainframe. While Soviet systems required manual correction for radar lag and altitude variation, the E-3 corrected in-flight with algorithms adapted from Apollo guidance systems. Soviet expectation, 45 seconds to full intercept vectoring. American reality, 7 seconds from detection to engagement trajectory. Progressive scoring, MiG-23 vector planning, 30 seconds. F-15 vector reception from AWACS, 6.2 seconds. MiG-23 radar acquisition, 15 seconds, post-liftoff. AWACS tracking of same aircraft, 8 seconds before liftoff. Not 10% faster, 300% faster. The final layer, intent, prediction. AWACS wasn't just watching heat or radar signatures. It used runway patterns, alert statuses, and known command timing to anticipate launch windows. A NATO engineer called it tactical weather forecasting. It didn't predict the future. It just removed enough uncertainty to act before the enemy could. Credential drop number 6. Colonel James Roberts flew the first E-3 systems test over the Gulf of Mexico. "We didn't hunt contacts," he said. "We hunted consequences." The Soviets built radar to react. The Americans built radar to decide. Euro 320 hours, April 14th, 1983, Greenland airspace. Operation Arctic Watch, NATO's live intercept drill at high latitudes. Scenario: simulate a Soviet bomber run from Murmansk toward U.S. northern defenses. AWACS airborne, call sign Sentinel-1, E-3 Sentry reaches station altitude, 31,000 feet, 360-degree coverage engaged. MiG-23s lift from Olynya Air Base, Soviet observers embedded as training monitors. Officially, just an exercise, but unofficially, it's a test. The Soviets want to see how fast NATO can react. They're not ready for the answer. E-322. MiG-23 canopies close, radar cold, no emissions. E-3217. AWACS detects MiG engine bloom via IR satellite relay. Vector plotted, F-15s notified. 03230, MiGs taxi. F-15s already bank east, no comms, no radar lock. 032411, Soviet radar sees first NATO blip. AWACS already tracking 4 minutes. 032518, MiGs airborne. GCI calculates intercept. Americans are already there. 3269, F-15 pilot visual on MiG pair. No radar ping, just a message. Visual confirmed. Intercept complete. Simulated kill. Total time 5 minutes. 12 seconds from first heat signature. F-15s never turned on radar. Soviet observers stunned. One remarks, they moved before we did. Reversal lines. They called AWACS a barn. They stopped laughing when barns started seeing through clouds. They dismissed predictive combat as fiction. They stopped dismissing it when fiction outran their fastest jets. They mocked data warfare. They stopped mocking when data fought and won without a shot. Cumulative score, first intercept 5 minutes, 12 seconds. First contact 68 seconds after liftoff. Total simulated kills 7 MiGs. NATO losses 0. Soviet pilot debrief. We launched into the dark. They flew toward light. We never saw the plane that got us. Final AWACS update file logged before Soviets reached cruise altitude. Last line from Sentinel-1, log target vector, matched predictive flight path. Margin of error, 12 meters. They weren't fighting jets. They were fighting math, and the math was American. The doctrine that won Vietnam was obsolete by the time it reached Greenland, in 5 minutes. The PVO lost what took 50 years to build. The internal reviews didn't take weeks. They took hours. Back in Moscow, as intercept timelines were analyzed and telemetry decrypted, the pattern was undeniable. The question wasn't how the Americans moved so fast. It was why the Soviets still thought speed mattered. Information versus interception. Soviet strategy relied on seeing an object, identifying it, and sending fighters to intercept it. But the Americans weren't intercepting aircraft. They were intercepting decisions. The moment the MiGs started their engines, wrote one Soviet analyst, AWACS already knew where they were going. Software versus hardware. The Soviets built better radars, stronger beams, greater range. But the Americans built better systems ones that interpreted, fused, and shared data across dozens of platforms instantly. A colonel in Soviet Air Defense Command wrote, "They didn't outbuild us. They outcomputed us." Prediction versus reaction. The Soviet model reacted to threats, detected, tracked, engaged. The American model predicted the threat's behavior and was already there before the flight path formed. One GRU officer phrased it grimly. By the time we saw the future, we were in it. Systems versus objects. Soviet engineers focused on building superior machines, better jets, better missiles. The Americans focused on relationships between machines, jet, radar, satellite, uplink, all synchronized. One MiG might outturn an F-15, but no MiG could outthink a network. Control versus autonomy. In the Soviet model, a controller told the pilot where to fly. In the American model, the plane was already flying the best path, fed live by sensors, satellites, and AWACS. They weren't flying aircraft. They were flying algorithms. Doctrinal collapse reports emerged inside the General Staff Academy. Dozens of exercises had shown similar outcomes. Soviet interceptors arriving after the Americans had already positioned. The conclusion came slowly but clearly. The Cold War air war would not be won by steel, fuel, or courage. It would be won by milliseconds. And the Soviets had designed their entire air defense system for minutes. The radar screen sits in a museum now. Petrozavodsk, back room. No placard. It's dark gray, green overlay, faded coordinates, one final blip frozen in the top right quadrant. The MiG never left the ground. But the intercept vector is already drawn. Most visitors think it's broken. It isn't. That screen was not just a relic. It was a coffin lid for a doctrine that believed visibility equaled control. It was the physical proof that control had shifted from radar operators to algorithms, from command posts to airborne domes. It marked the moment when seeing wasn't fast enough. The Americans had built systems that didn't need to wait for blips. They knew what came next. They saw the pattern behind the action, the logic behind the launch, the intention behind the noise. They didn't need eyes. They had prediction. The Petrozavodsk screen went blank that morning, not from failure, from irrelevance. The Soviets remembered the day the MiGs flew. History remembers the day the intercept was plotted before the runway lights turned on. The Cold War wasn't won in dogfights. It was won with AWACS radomes, signal fusion, and software Moscow couldn't see because it wasn't looking in the right century.